everyone. My name is Michael Spath, and I'm the Executive Director of the Indiana Center for Middle East Peace in Fort Wayne, Indiana. I also work with the Emmaus Road Mennonite Fellowship in Bern, also with the Global Justice Coalition in Palestine, ICAD USA with Jeff Halper, and Friends of Hebron with Isa Amro. Thank you all for joining us today. Right up front, we need to acknowledge that we're at 683 days of Israel's ethnic cleansing and genocide in Gaza and throughout Palestine. The issues we're discussing are not academic. They're life and death for people we care about, and they're life and death for people in our country, too. 3.5 weeks ago, Churches for Middle East Peace gathered over 100 Christian leaders and activists at the Carter Center for a strategic peace-building strategy meeting. These leader activists came from Palestine, the U.S., Black and Hispanic churches, Europe, South Africa, Australia, and elsewhere. The questions: how can the followers of Jesus present a unified witness to stand against the genocide happening in Palestine? How can we be more effective in our Christian advocacy for Palestine? I was there, as were our three distinguished panelists. Marietta Macy is a Presbyterian pastor, co-moderator of the Palestine Justice Network of the Presbyterian Church, USA. David Wildman is Executive Secretary for Human Rights and Racial Justice with United Methodist Church and works with grassroots partners in the Middle East and Afghanistan. And Philip Farah is a Palestinian American activist, born in Jerusalem, co-founder of the Washington Interfaith Alliance for Middle East Peace and Palestinian Christian Alliance for Peace. I have a number of questions for our guests, but if you'd like to ask them a question, please do that via the chat function at the bottom of the screen. If possible, we're going to be monitoring the chat, and so if possible, we'll try to get your questions asked. So there's lots to talk about today. We'll jump right in. This question's for each one of you. Even though Palestinian Christians are only about 1% of the population, they have an outsized voice throughout Palestine. And here in the U.S., virtually each of the mainline denominations has a formal or informal group to support Palestine. One of the goals of the meeting was to present a unified Christian voice on Palestine. Is it possible? Is it necessary? And what are the obstacles? Marietta?
Well, I was kind of hoping I'd have a second to think about that. That's a really good question, Michael, and thank you for inviting us all, and thank you all for attending. It's wonderful to be with you today. I think that's one of the larger themes or takeaways that I'm still reflecting on, is because this gathering had such a wide breadth of the Christian body of Christ represented. That was a challenge. It was also a gift. And I think that shows us some of our growing areas, but also where some of our mutual strengths are. And I'll admit, as a Presbyterian who's done a lot of work with our denominational policy, with advocating for divestment, for huge shifts like that, it was grounding to remember how differently different denominations function in their structures. And so because of some of those changes, some of our progress and some of our work is going to look differently. And what is going to be effective to move us towards all advocating collectively for justice for Palestinians is going to look a little differently too. And so I think one of our gifts that we can have this kind of multifaceted approach and recognize the full diversity that God has gifted us with, and use all of those things to promote the same goals. But it is also a bit of a challenge to figure out how to unite strategically, since we are in different places with our theology and with our comfort levels on speaking out publicly, for example, or engaging politically. I think that can be a challenge across the churches too, as our relationship with these topics and with how we live out our faith in our social structures as well.
David?
Sure. Thanks, Michael, and thanks also to everybody who's joining. It's great to see such a good attendance. Yeah, I think, Michael, it's a very biblical question. I mean, like John the Baptist's disciples were coming to the disciples of Jesus and asking, like, the same thing. Is this a unified thing? Or like, are you with this camp? Are you with that camp? So to me, I think Jesus's response is a good one for us to respond to now for churches about a unified voice is, what do you see? So I see a lot of years of BDS work, of boycott, divestment, and sanctions. I see folks joining flotillas. I see folks going on pilgrimages of solidarity. But clearly, and lots and lots of statements. We love, when in doubt, we like to say things rather than do things, especially the leaders. And so, a lot of us are at a moment of frustration. But I don't think it's necessarily around the unity. It's around what more do we need to do, and where do we need to push for really mass mobilization of lots of folks getting into the streets. And I think that this conference was an effort, a humble effort at that, of bringing people together and forcing us to listen to one another and to give voice to strategies with one another. But yeah, it's a challenge, and no sooner than Jesus left the scene and was resurrected, I mean, like, the empire was still there, and Paul and Peter had slightly different versions of, like, disciples. So the church has had a long history of how not to unify. So I'm more worried about mobilizing than unifying.
Philip? Thanks, David. Thanks, Marietta.
Yes, I again, thank you, Mike, and thank you, everybody. It's really heartening to see all of you today. I agree with both speakers, but I am, I do think it's a challenge to get more unity. We are, I think, too fragmented as a movement. And I think, it's kind of in the nature of more democratic people to be fragmented. And some of that is not bad, that, different groups, organizations know their constituencies better. And so too much centralization is not good. But I also feel that when there is a democratic process where the rank and file really have a say-so, that there is a great deal of agreement. And like for example, the Lutherans just passed, the Lutherans had their synod, General Synod recently, actually while we were meeting in Atlanta, and 95% plus voted for calling this a genocide and for calling on the government to stop funding Israel. Unfortunately, I think, the leaders always come behind, and when the when the process for decision making, for actions, etc., is not democratic, then the leaders tend to take a much more kind of how do you call it, careful, let's say.
Yeah.
And I think it's very important for us, in the churches, in the Christian communities, to push harder, push our leaders. But I do think that the organizers, CMAP especially, with the help of many others, was very, very well organized, amazingly well organized. They invited, so many people who needed to be there, and they did a very good job of kind of conducting the business.
Thank you, Philip. Zugby was present from Bethlehem and gave a devotion, and Munther Isaac was present too, gave a powerful keynote address at the beginning of the meeting with a challenge. What we've done so far isn't enough. Too many churches are complicit in their silence or in their what I call empathy and prayers. What can we do differently, he asked. and what can we do that's more effective than we've done in the past. So we're going to get into the specifics of each one of the task forces in a minute, but I'd like your reactions to Munther's challenge to us. David?
Sure, thanks. Yeah, I think this is a critical question um, for the churches. And I think the complicity is, I'll say it's kind of like an Emmaus moment. Despite the fact that churches give a lot of power to the word and to singing, and when we try and have hopefully a unified voice when we're singing, our complicity, we're too often more like Pilate from the story of the crucifixion. We want to wash our hands, and we figure that's how to be clean. But in the Emmaus, the big question for me is when the two disciples were like walking along and didn't recognize Jesus, and all the Bible stories, all the sort of going through the theological discussion, they didn't recognize him till they broke bread together and had a meal together. And then what happened there, and this is where I think churches are, that, some of us have broken bread together with our Palestinian Christians and have heard them, but we're not willing to look at our portfolios yet of our investments. We're not yet willing to look at further actions of civil disobedience and other kinds of things that are very much needed at this very difficult time. But those two disciples give a sense of instead of heading to the upper room, they headed back into the city of Jerusalem where the military occupation was at its height. It's where all the soldiers were. They headed back there. So I think that's the challenge for us now is how do the churches head to the centers of power, to the U.S. government, to keep demanding from Congress. There's been an overwhelming outpouring of letters and phone calls and presence and disturbance in congressional offices. But like the widow and the unjust judge, we need to wear them out. So I think right now, what I heard Munther saying of ending complicity is, are you willing to join a ministry of erosion that wears out the powerful? And specifically, that's the U.S. government and the Israeli government.
Thanks, David. Philip?
Yes, let me just very quickly, I took notes from Munder's speech, and then my notes say, name the genocide, name things as they are, apartheid, ethnic cleansing, genocide especially, and condemn all Zionism, including the peace and reconciliation language of liberal churches. Very heavy emphasis on BDS, not just the settlers, the settlements, but the whole system. Alliances not only with other Christians, but also interfaith. And I took that to mean alliances across the spectrum of activists, including secular, and support Sumud, especially of indigenous Christians. Act, not just admire our Sumud from a distance, support hospital, schools, etc., etc. I want to give an example of probably Munder is really not as aware as some of us about how, this business of peace and reconciliation and careful language of the leaders plays out. I see the American Jewish Committee and the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, as kind of the good cop and the bad cop. The good cop is the AJC. And the AJC has really focused very, very heavily on churches. They are really they talk a liberal kind of language, but they recently published a document called Translate Hate Against Anti-Semitism. And it is a blatant, well, sometimes subtle, but not so subtle attempt to really shut down any support for any meaningful solidarity with the Palestinians. And to our chagrin, the U.S. Council of Catholic Bishops adopted the whole document.
Right.
As is pretty much, slapped on it the subtitle of Catholic edition and added just some endnotes, I don't know what you call them, basically validating everything that's in the document. And it's really and this was in the middle of the genocide. It has, language like Israel's right to self-defense as a justification, really, for the genocide that's occurring. It completely says, categorically denies that there was ethnic cleansing in 1948, which is like a basic precept of, and this is true not only of the Catholic Council of Bishops. There are many leaders that express horror and add very strong adjectives to what happened on October 7. No such language relative to what Israel is doing. No use of the word genocide. No strong. In fact, like our heart bleeds for the Palestinians, for the thousands killed, always in the passive voice. Always in the passive voice.
Yeah.
So this is the kind of thing that Munder is really talking about. And we have the activists here who focus on Christian communities, see this, we talk to church leaders and, really they express their heartfelt, emotions about the horror of what's happening to Palestinians. But they just really, they have the ear of the American Jewish Committee. And
like I say, empathy and a prayer.
Right.
Yeah. Thanks, Philip. Marietta?
Yeah, I want to add to all of that. There's so much that he offered us, and so much that our Palestinian partners continue to, I think, light a fire under us in the best way. And I want to highlight David's point too, of going back to feel like our call as a church right now, because as a collective church, not just any individual one, is to wear this system down. We've put out great statements. We've made some good policy decisions, but too often in our churches every Sunday, folks are not addressing this. There's no reaction. There's no pressure for our government from them to change anything. And I can say within the PCUSA, we have senators and congresspeople and other state and government officials who are the people who are directly responsible and able to change their votes and stop these things from happening, that claim to be Christians, that claim that are members of Presbyterian congregations. And we're letting our siblings in the faith continue to pretend like they're living out this call to love our neighbors as Jesus teaches us, and still be the ones who are actively voting and getting paid to send these bombs, to build this apartheid system, and to profit from genocide. So we need to do a lot of our own, I think, inward work as churches, as denominations, but as, like, I really mean individual congregations. Like, who are your neighbors in the pew next to you? How are they engaging with this issue? These are the Christians that are, as Munther says, still complicit. Our denominations are, but we are individually. That's part of why we're called to do these, collective prayers of forgiveness and confession every week. But we have a lot to work through before I think we deserve that kind of grace from our neighbors at this point. So I really, I struggle also with our good-hearted Christian tendency to think if we just show the right victim to people, if we just show the right starving child, it will change people's minds. If they just learn what's going on, it will change people's minds, because as a kind person, that may be all that it took for you to become aware. But again, we have Presbyterian senators who are sitting in our pews, who are sending these bombs, hearing these same prayers, and they do not respond to that same information ethically and compassionately as you might. So we need to look at how to wear down these systems. Persistent widow, wearing down the judge style. She didn't count on his moral behavior to change, but she annoyed him enough, tore down the system enough that justice could happen. So that's what I'm hearing from Munther and others as well.
Thanks, Marietta. I want to get into the task forces and really the work of the conference. And I know that there were lots of conversations over the the 6 or 7 hours that we gathered during the 4 different sessions, but I'm going to ask you to kind of be brief in describing. So there were 3 main task forces: church and denominational engagement, speaking to the church; government engagement advocacy, speaking to government; and grassroots mobilization, speaking to civil society. There was another one, strategic foresight, which Ben Norquist and I will be convening and chairing, and we've been meeting about that. So, Marietta, you took part in the church and denominational task force. 3 of the recommendations, and you can pick one or briefly cover all of them. There were others, but develop worship resource materials, outreach to evangelicals around Christian Zionism, and how to de-weaponize anti-Semitism. You want to say a word about the work of your task force?
Yeah, it was, as I mentioned earlier, this is one of the areas, since I wasn't on this task force, the spectrum of denominations and of Christianity that we had represented was beautiful and particularly vivid in this case. As we're trying to figure out what we can unite around as denominations, we came down to try, after we worked through some of the challenges, remembering that worship is one of the things that we have in common. And so working on highlighting some of those seasons that we share and how we can draw attention to this issue as we go into the season of Advent, for example, as we go into to World Communion coming up soon, as Lent approaches next year. These are all times that are particularly vivid, where we talk about our theology, but also how that relates to what's happening in the world. So those are areas of work that we highlighted. But in those seasons, especially, those are times that really terrible and hurtful theology can come out. And this is where anti-Semitism creeps into our churches, even ones that we think it is not in. It is. We have supersessionist theology that comes out at a lot of these liturgical seasons that we think we can remove from the modern reality that history of anti-Semitism has created. And then also, these are times where our churches can get manipulated and appropriated to support Zionist and Christian nationalist principles. So having the both the kind of worship resources and some theological education of understanding all of those issues enough that we can recognize them when we're encountering them, and then work to unpack that, to pull it out of our churches when we can, and be able to see the real political and social damage that's coming from those things. So we often, I think, as Christians, like to think that, or especially as in our Reformed branch, we lean a lot on education, and we think we learn about something, we did our work, and then if we pray about it in church, then we did it. But the next step of that is, actually being the body of Christ and mobilizing for real. So that was another area that we crossed into, about how do we turn these beliefs that we do share into campaigns that can make some difference. And that work, of course, crossed over with the other committees as well, which was I hope, a helpful reminder for all of us how intersectional a lot of this work is when we look at church and society and different identities, and how we can use those things and those diversities to our advantage.
Thanks, Marietta. David and Philip, you were both in the grassroots mobilization task force that I attended. A couple of things that were really focused on. Philip, would you please talk about the Go to Gaza effort?
Yes, I'm glad that you brought this up, because it'll help me address another point. So there were folks in our 2 people, well, 3 of us who have relatives in Gaza on that committee. One of them, Khalil Sayer, lost his sister, a beautiful young woman of 19, Lara Sayer, who died as she was walking away from the church where her family was sheltering to seek refuge in Egypt. So they pushed very hard for going to Gaza. And that can be done in several ways. One of them is supporting or even participating in the flotillas that I'm sure most, if not all of your listeners have heard of the flotillas.
Right.
That's a way to challenge the siege on Gaza, the Israeli siege, and bring a lot of attention, world attention to this. And it seems like, a couple, like now there are many people talking about not just one flotilla, but several flotillas going together. That's one way. Another way is is actually going to the land route, going to Israel or Egypt and going close to the border. And there's a group of Catholics that, well, mostly Catholics that led an effort to do this. And so that's another way. And by the way, my mentioning Catholics, I didn't mean to single out the Catholics when I mentioned the USCCB, because we have allies among our Catholic brethren and sisters who are doing amazing work. And that was one of them. But then there were some people who said, look, not everybody has that level of risk. So is willing to take that level of risk of going on a flotilla or actually going to the Gaza border. So people spoke about virtual going to Gaza, and there are all kinds of ways that people can support that effort, without actually going there. So yeah, this was one of the strong recommendations of our committee.
Thank you, Philip.
Of our task force, I mean. Yeah.
Yeah. David, you spent years working on BDS, and one of the recommendations was a more aggressive BDS focus. You really emphasized this at our meeting. In fact, the United Methodist Church, which you know something about, has voted to divest from Israel bonds and other governments that maintain illegal military occupations. The first church in the world to do that. You want to talk a little bit about the task force's work with this more aggressive BDS focus?
Sure. Yeah. When we were in the grassroots task force, we kind of divided in half for a good part of the time. And Philip shared about the Go to Gaza, but there was also the ending corporate complicity and the church's involvement in that corporate complicity through our pension funds, through our endowments at church-based universities. And I think one of the things people forget of a year ago from the encampment movement is every single encampment was a divestment movement to demand accountability of the trustees of the institution to say, we don't want our education to be complicit with the genocide that's going on in Gaza and the destruction of Palestine more broadly on the West Bank and East Jerusalem as well. So that got lost in the focus on the free speech and just the sort of the horrendous clamping down, the police state actions against the encampments. But those are all ongoing divestment campaigns. So, I mean, I've often said like boycott, divestment, and sanctions are things that churches have done before with farm workers, with the anti-apartheid movement, with joining labor unions about struggles, and they work. They've actually changed corporate policies. They've changed behavior like the unjust judge, maybe not mindsets. That's up to God. So why would we not want to use something that we have practice doing and experience and that has worked and is what our Palestinian siblings are calling for through the 20 years ago, the issuing of the BDS call for freedom, justice, and equality. And so the most recent action by the United Methodist Board of Pensions, WestPath, was at the beginning of August to announce that they had sold off their sovereign debt in a number of countries, and they named 60 countries that had either prolonged military occupations, authoritarian regimes, or extensive political corruption as measured by human rights organizations. So they developed a metric, which I think will be hopefully a model that can be used. And, a lot of times the pension funds, I mean, every one of us who's been involved with divestment campaigns in denominations, Presbyterians, Episcopalians, Methodists, others, have all run into folks. Well, we like shareholder engagement. We feel if we talk to the company, that's more effective. Well, if you're buying a bond, you can't talk to the company. You either buy the bond or you don't buy the bond. And so we were challenging these pension funds, like our own Westpath, to say you can't engage except for beforehand to ask them questions about human rights. And then you decide whether to buy it or not. But the record is pretty clear. So why would you have bonds in any of these countries? And so I think that was a good sign. They recognized that they listened to constituents, like what Philip was saying earlier about the democratization in the church, which is a constant struggle. It's not something that we succeed with. It's an ongoing struggle. That they listened and did make this. So Israel bonds are one of the ones that's identified. We're not going to buy bonds in South Sudan. We're not going to buy bonds in Russia, in other places, China. So it's a more comprehensive human rights frame, but clearly Israel's complicity. And I think it opens the door and joins a lot of other movements, Jewish Voice for Peace. There's been a Minnesota Break the Bonds campaign for, I think, like 20 years now.
Yeah.
And working with public funds to engage. So there's a lot of ways that we can engage with labor unions also. So it's, I think, a good alliance building technique as well. And then I'll just end with, anyone who knows me knows I love scripture. I think the whole Bible is a boycott, divestment, and sanctions manual. So if you haven't read it that way, like you should, Paul wrote to the churches at the heart of the empire, Romans, and they never got a response that we know of. So maybe the Carter Center was part of that response. And he said in the 14th chapter, he said, if there's something you eat or consume that is causing harm to a sister or brother, don't do it. Stop. That's a boycott. Out of solidarity. So our Palestinian sisters and brothers are saying, boycott. Do not be complicit with these companies that are literally killing us and taking our land through the settlements. And Paul is reminding us, if your siblings are being hurt, even if you don't notice that or whatever, don't do it. And so I think there's a tremendous biblical mandate for us to really deepen and strengthen and broaden our boycott, divestment, and sanctions work.
David, I was reluctant to call on you about this because if Paul was the first apostle of BDS, you might be the second apostle of BDS. Let me follow up with a question I don't have written here. The planning committee for the conference did an excellent job, I thought. One of the questions they challenged us with that I'm wondering if there's still more work to be done, how well we were able to answer it, was what we've done so far, all the work that all the many denominations and churches and other secular groups have done, civil society, we've not stopped the ethnic cleansing. And in fact, we've not made much of a dent here in the U.S. We can argue about how much and all the rest, but the genocide is continuing and the war machine is continuing. And they challenged us in each one of our groups to say, what we've been doing so far hasn't been working. Is there some new idea or some ramped up sort of approach, something more? How well do you think we did that? And I know, David, you kind of just suggested that this is a more aggressive BDS approach, addressing corporate complicity. I'd like for each one of you, if you'd like to just address how we met the challenge of the planning committee. Philip, you want to start?
Sure. I also wanted to mention that the other keynote, I think 3 keynote speakers, Reverend Munder of
we're going to get to Bishop Tabo if you're going to.
Oh, okay, good enough. Yeah. But that example is really important. That's an example of a amazing struggle that succeeded using largely BDS tactics, and specifically, notably, boycott, cultural boycott of singers and soccer teams, sports boycott had a huge impact.
Yeah.
And I want to also move on to another aspect. I'll go back to your question, tie it all up. That in many of our actions, we see more rabbis participate than Christian clergy, certainly relative to the population of Jews in this country and population of Christians, So that's another point that I have regarding church leaders. And, we are most effective moving our constituency, which is the leadership of the denominations. We have less sway over the political leaders, but through our denominational leaders, that has a huge psychological impact that will affect our church leaders, and that happened in South Africa. And to David's point about the Israel bonds strategy, divesting from those. JVP has a very strong campaign in that regard too. So another point that was made by some speakers and in some of our meetings is that we need to connect and unite with other campaigns. Now, there's already an existing campaign to boycott Chevron. And it's not only faith people, it's not only Christians, it's also Muslim groups, Jewish groups, and secular groups. So that's what we need to do differently. Now, and we can also tie these actions to other, the intersectionality aspect of it. Palantir, for example, which is one of the companies that we talked about boycotting as a target. Now that is involved in police brutality. It's involved in immigration. Even though their leadership is extremely, frankly, evil, but still, they are susceptible to shaming and naming and actions, for example, in front of their offices to draw attention to their evil. That is something that moves investors, and so they're afraid of these things. So, both Munzer and Archbishop Tabo, advised us to work creatively, and there's so many people who are doing this. Not only Palestinians, but many of our supporters are linking these issues together: immigration, police brutality, etc., etc. So, in that, the lay of the land is really changing, and we're kind of, frankly, a little bit behind.
Thank you, Philip. Marietta?
Yeah, I'm going to continue on this BDS conversation, because I do think that overall is the answer to this. The question that you posed and the planning team posed, did we meet that challenge? And as we've discussed, and historically it has proven true, that these regimes of evil don't end because everybody woke up one day and said, yeah, that's actually makes me sad, I'm not going to do that anymore. It's because they weren't profitable, and there wasn't they lost power for engaging in these behaviors. And we need to make that the risk for these companies and for these officials who are creating and prolonging this genocide. Make this a risk for them, not the people who are on the receiving end of the bombs. And these economic actions are the way that we can do that. And I want to highlight too is showing how well we work together. Along with the Methodists, the Peace USA has divested from Israeli bonds as well. We did that last year, last General Assembly, and passed an overture to start a process of divestment engagement with Palantir. And that was before they kind of broke the headlines here in the US for engaging in surveillance here against folks when we already know that's what's happening in Palestine. And I think that's a perfect example of how these systems, government systems, but these military industrial complex and intelligence systems are being used to destroy many, many, many people's lives. And we don't have to be as fractured as we think fighting these injustices. And Palestine is really a key that unites a lot of them and makes a lot of these situations very clear. So I think us as denominations, as churches, as individual people of faith, showing up and continuing to use the agency that we have as individuals and denominations with these huge pension funds is one of the most effective ways that we can meet that challenge. Because there's a conversation that has stuck with me on my most recent trip to Palestine is during the genocide. Our group had a meeting at the U.S. Embassy in Jerusalem with a U.S. official. And one of the things that he said during that meeting, it's one of the only things I've ever remembered that an official has said, but that we were giving these really passionate statements and people had prepared to speak to him because, this felt like a big deal. And he said at one point that you cannot expect moral behavior from a government. Governments are not moral entities, and you cannot expect them to behave as such. So that I've thought about that since that meeting. That's over a year ago now. And I'm to the point where I'm like, fine, I'm not going to argue ethics and morality anymore. That's why I'm engaged in this personally. That's why I care and have made this choice. But that's not what's going to end this. It has to cost these people something, and we have to make that clear. And they're not going to change their minds because their moral heart shifted. It's because they're gonna lose what they value, which is not their own humanity, because that seems to already be gone. So I think continuing to appeal to that to make these shifts is not what's going to be most effective.
I really appreciate you mentioning that, Marietta. Linda Noonan in our chat quoted our friend Issa Amro in his latest U.S. tour, and he's coming back, by the way, either in the fall or probably next spring to the U.S. But Issa said, you've got to make the genocide, the occupation, the ethnic cleansing, you got to make it too costly for these, not only for the companies, but too costly for individuals and churches. That's the only way they're going to pay attention. David.
Oh, sure. We have another 2 hours, right? So I just no. Yeah, I think the churches are being challenged by Munter, especially at the Carter Center, but more broadly by our Palestinian siblings and the 20th anniversary of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions call, to re-understand what the BDS call is really about. And I think many of us have engaged very faithfully and actively for many years and divested from particular companies. But too many folks in the churches saw it as a divestment of clean hands. Like, I don't want to be partaking in evil. And that is an excellent strategy and a necessary, important thing. But I think more deeply is to understand that the BDS were tools. Boycott, divestment, and sanctions are simply tools to be used for the goal of freedom, justice, and equality. So freedom from military occupation and settler colonialism, justice for refugees that have been denied the right of return and reparations, and equality for Palestinians, 1 state, 2 states, 10 states, that there are equal rights for all. And if we understand those goals, the root of that is Palestinian self-determination. And too many of the churches have looked at our BDS work as part of ending a conflict instead of ending systematic oppression of genocide, apartheid, settler colonialism. That means breaking our relationships with the rabbi down the street that clergy has good relationships with. And that relationship is still more important than the relationships with our Palestinian siblings because they're further away. And so I think that that's one of the challenges. Martin Luther King reminded us during the Vietnam War of, like, it's one thing to do what the Good Samaritan did. He got off his horse, he helped the guy, he got him to an inn. Amazing humanitarian, he was a humanitarian worker who gained access and was able to get there and do something. That's absolutely imperative. But King goes on to say that's only an initial act one day we have to say the whole Jericho, like, how did this road get so dangerous? Because there's an empire, there's a systemic problem of oppression, of militarism, racism, and materialism or capitalism. And so I think until we dig deeper as churches and face that and look at our portfolios and to understand that BDS is really long-term work. It's not like you pick a campaign, and this is the last thing I'll say right now. We've bought into the capitalist idea that the solution is always something new, rather than maybe we have the solution in our hands already. In our experience, we don't need something new. And so we say, well, we tried civil disobedience. Well, what new? We've tried letters, we've tried calls, we've tried statements. What more could we do? We've tried flotillas. No, we need more of our work. It is working. And I think that's what hope is, and what the Palestinians remind us better than anyone is hope's what you can't see. If you can see it, it's not hope. It's like a AI prediction about positive, optimist percentages. But hope is what we can't see at the moment. But if the widow had given up on her 10th try or her 50th try, the unjust judge would have ruled the day. And so I think part of BDS is saying we don't have the privilege and luxury to give up because our Palestinian siblings are not giving up.
Thanks, David. Thanks to all of you. One of the ideas, I want to ask you about government engagement now and advocacy. Even though we weren't part of that task force, I read through the dozen or more pages of notes that were taken from that task force, and one of the ideas was planning a day of Christian action at the Capitol. And so I want to ask you there's two parts to this question. And again, we're about maybe 15, 20 minutes from closing. So please, I'm going to ask you to keep your answers brief. But the first part of the question is, talk to us about just government advocacy and engagement and what you think is the best way to, what's the best way to do that in these times. I used to think that Capitol Hill was occupied territory, but there seems to be some openings now. But the other thing, and this was a little controversial, there was disagreement in this task force about some folks believe that there was an opening in this administration and Congress around the issue of religious freedom, and that some folks who we might have thought were opponents might be able to be convinced over the issue of religious freedom for Palestinians, and especially action on behalf of Palestinians in this country. So those two parts of the question. So Philip?
Yes.
You're right there in DC.
Yeah. Well, I definitely think that it is extremely important to lobby Congress, but there is, I think now there's an opportunity to tell many of our elected representatives that, sometimes, a lot of the time, the money coming from donors trumps what your constituency think about issues. If AIPAC is your donor and they care, about your vote and put money to influence your vote, you might weigh that against the damage that can be done by taking a position. And if your constituency isn't really moving, then, you just go with AIPAC. But now there is a juncture where, people are really, really knowledgeable about this and frankly, very pissed about this. And we need to communicate to our congressmen through things like BDS, through actions, that are very, very visible, through actions like the Mennonites did and Jewish Voice for Peace, where they got arrested in the halls of Congress and the halls of power. That, this is a juncture in history where our votes are going to trump the money that you are getting from donors. So I think that's very important. And I want to mention something regarding what David said. You know, we're doing a lot of things, and they have not stopped the genocide. That's true, of course. You know, we see that, but you know, things can really turn very quickly, and I think they are turning very quickly. You know, South Africa, the South African freedom movement did not expect the collapse of apartheid. You know, I mean, the grassroots movement forced Thatcher and Reagan kicking and screaming to comply with the boycott of South Africa, and that really happened to a large extent psychologically as much as it did because of economic pressure. As you know, singers, as soccer teams, etc., as whites all over the world who were mainstream, not marginal students, not not minorities of color. And that is happening, and this psychological collapse was due to racism being, the racists in South Africa. Hearing from whites that this is not in our name, and when Jews are participating with us in these rallies, saying not in our name, that sends a huge message to Israel. So and politicians will listen, as the politicians did in the case of South Africa, and pushed eventually Reagan and Thatcher to fall in line.
Thanks, Philip. David?
Yeah, I think Philip has already laid out, for decades, the question of Israel, not Palestine, but the question of Israel was a domestic policy issue for Congress. It was not a foreign policy issue. It was about the money that was going to campaigns. It was about voter constituency in certain places. Christian Zionists being the largest voting bloc for the Republican Party. They've got lots of money from lots of different sources, but Christian Zionists are the biggest number of voters that will deliver faithfully or unfaithfully, one might say, for the GOP. And so that's shifting a little bit, that suddenly people are like, oh my God, starvation. Maybe we can't use the G word of genocide yet, but they're moved, but not moved enough. And so I think churches have misunderstood the story of Zacchaeus. We are so busy trying to climb the tree to where Congress is, to talk to them and say, what's an opening? So maybe like starvation and genocide and like 62,000 people killed by US provided bombs is not enough, but maybe religious freedom, or protecting the properties of the Greek Orthodox Church, or just allowing a few visas for humanitarian workers. Those are important issues. We got to struggle on all of those. But to engage Congress, we need to invite them to come down. And I think a number of groups, more before October 7th, were doing work of trying to get staffers from congressional offices of like, go meet with Palestinians, see what's happening in Bethlehem for yourself. And if you went, and that did make an impact in some of those offices, not all, but it's slow work. So I do want to say sometimes, in addition to the widow and the persistence, there's also Jesus saying, you got to shake the dust off your feet. If you're not welcome, you need to go somewhere else. And that's where I think BDS is misunderstood, that corporations hate bad publicity far more than members of Congress. They get elected as a senator, and they've got 5 years before they have to think about anything. And nobody, like a long historical view, is like what happened last month. And so they're not going to listen. But a company that starts getting bad press, like SodaStream a number of years ago, was like, we got to think about changing this, not because we agree, but we don't want this a boycott of our product because it looks bad. So I think that BDS has also identified a much more vulnerable point of stopping the economic complicity of so many corporations. And then I think also, Philip, it was very, any of us who were active in the 1980s, in 1985 around South Africa, or issues of human rights, democracy in Eastern Europe or the Soviet Union, if you had said that like in 5 years, Mandela will be released from prison, and and all of the ANC, the African National Congress, would be unbanned, and that Mandela will be elected the first democratic government in South Africa 9 years later, from 1985, people would said, no way, not with, maybe with a bloodbath, but no, and there's plenty of blood, but it was not nearly what people feared. And so I think that we have to remember that hope, that Palestinians are like, well, it'll get worse, but we still have hope. But in fact, now it's gotten so worse that I think our Palestinian, what I've heard from Munter Zugbi, many, many other Palestinians, the human rights groups, is we need your hope and your actions to keep us going. And I think in the 80s with South Africa, the South Africans were saying, we're doing what we could do on the ground, but we need the international movement as well. And only when we're working together. And so that's where I would say the last thing is to stay on message. And so what your very first question was about unifying, a unified voice, I would say stay on message about the right of Palestinians to determine their own destiny. And are we as churches willing to walk with our Palestinian siblings in that struggle, both Christian and Muslim and atheist and others, and the Jewish allies within Israel and here, that will we walk for them to be able to make decisions about their own destiny and not what we think is good for them?
Marietta?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question to think about. I've had a lot of thoughts while y'all were talking. I appreciate your comments. One of the things that I want to add is my own geographic context in the U.S., my life here in the U.S. has given me, I think, a slightly different view on our politics here. And what I would encourage us to think about is a couple things of thinking longer term, because you're right, like once folks get in office, they don't care until it's election season again, and they count on people having short memories. But we have people who are elected now in office. I am from Southern Indiana. Mike Pence's brother was my congressman when I lived there. I've lived in Kentucky, and now I live here in Charleston, West Virginia. And I have never in my life had a representative that has actually represented me, even as a white woman. I'll just take that identity solely. But as a Christian and as somebody who has social justice concerns and who does community work, we have people who are elected in these places who are actively killing the people in our own streets. They're taking food out of our own children's mouths in West Virginia and letting them starve and still expecting those children to grow up and go fight wars for them. West Virginia sends more of their children to fight, and we have one of the lowest populations in the country. As we know, been hit hugely with the opioid crisis. So the people that we have in these positions of power do not care about humanity. So when we do these large campaigns across the U.S. as organizations calling for everybody, call your representatives, write letters, go to their office, we're getting arrested going to their office to talk about domestic policy. So we also need to think strategically as siblings in the U.S. about our own privilege in certain places, and the people who have more safety and more hope and more access to somewhat ethical, or at least more strategic for the future of humanity, thinkers and representatives. Those are the folks who need to get mobilized, because there are some folks who are also here in West Virginia, I will say in Charleston, fighting for Palestinians while they're fighting for people here. But we have so many folks in the U.S. who are barely able to stay alive themselves. We're not able to mobilize for our siblings around the world. And that's true with Palestine. It's true with a whole lot of other issues. So when we're trying to engage in these, not just one-off campaigns, but around like the genocide this time, we've had different congressional campaigns, senatorial campaigns about other legislation that's come out as this history of apartheid has progressed. But we're not making the progress that we would like to see. And so I think we need to get strategic about knowing who is in our own neighborhoods, who's in our states, where do we as churches have good resources condensed and have access to representatives who are thoughtful people and reachable, and pressure those places, and then look at where we can help each other strengthen our own campaigns. But we need to be more targeted with who we're asking to do that work, and then we can be more successful with it, I think. But that's one of the things. So I'm willing to look for a crack, for a door open, to be around religious freedom around whatever the issue is. But I also know that those folks who have been my representatives, who will claim that they support religious freedom, they'll claim they support this, they're the same ones that are not going to apply that to me individually, or whoever, whatever clergy person or Christian ends up being the target carrying something out. That same freedom is not going to be applied. We know that that's how the law works when it applies to people who are deemed to be not fully human, of other races, of different gender identities. So we also shouldn't presume that, should we make a deal with the devil, kind of proverbially in this case, that's going to work out for us long term. I'm not saying to cut us off, and I don't want to lose any opportunities, but we do need to think strategically about the behaviors of these people, and how whether that's a safe choice long term or not.
Thanks, Marietta, and thanks to all of you. Listen, I've got a couple more questions and just a little bit of time left before we're going to have to go. So again, help me out here, gang, okay? As I mentioned, Ben Norquist from the CMEP staff, and I are convening the Strategic Foresight Task Force to assist the other three groups in their planning and action, including analyses of cultural, political, and theological trends, legislation, pushback from Zionist lobby, public opinion, etc. What advice do you have for our Strategic Foresight Task Force? Marietta?
Oh, can you say the areas again that you were just?
Well, we're going to be looking at cultural, political, and theological trends, legislation, pushback from the Zionist lobby, public opinion, what's happening on campuses. In other words, we're trying to, envision what the future landscape looks like for the activism, and how this can benefit the other three task forces.
Yeah, I think I know that Philip and David will have a lot to say about this too. So I'll offer this from a multi-generational perspective, that besides this area of work, I do a lot of children's and youth ministry. And so I have to figure out how to explain these topics and things that adults are talking about, concerned about, they see on the news, to children. And it's a really good challenge, because I feel like if you can't make sense to them, and you can't explain to them why an action is happening, there's pretty good chance that it's not clear, or it shouldn't be happening. And they're pretty good at calling out nonsense. And we are seeing students, especially as we've seen in the encampments, be incredibly passionate, incredibly dedicated, and willing to risk their own futures. And these are the American young people and people from around the world who have enough privilege to get into a school. I know that folks are coming with lots of different personal backgrounds, but they've at least got the access to get into a school and then make these choices. I think we need to follow their leadership with the fact that this is what they're willing to risk, and figure out how we can support more adults in making choices like this, but also continue supporting our generations who are upcoming. Because even if we end the genocide tomorrow, Gaza is destroyed. We've got people who have severe disabilities that are going to take they won't recover from in lifetimes. This is a generational issue that we're dealing with. So we need to think strategically right now, but also how can we continue to support future generations and strengthen them before they get to the moment of crisis where they have to make a decision like this. And so following them, supporting them, I can't think of a time in history where the student movement has really been, when history looks back on it, the ones that overreacted. I told somebody the other day too, and I think this is something we all, churches especially, need to take an example from and take some courage from, is that you're not going to look back on this time and say, oh, I really overreacted to that genocide and that fascism that was creeping into the US. I wish I hadn't done as much to help. I wish I hadn't been as loud about that. I can't imagine anybody with a truly compassionate heart looking back at this time and thinking that. So I think looking out for those folks who are upcoming leaders and figuring out how to support them and seeing the shifts that they're experiencing and taking real guidance from that instead of kind of trying to dictate back towards. As you're looking forward, they're going to be the ones who are adults when we get to that forward time. So working to undo some of this damage, working to help folks understand and honestly still believe that the church is worth being a part of. As in youth ministry, I was a struggle constantly. And I'll have kids that'll show up to city council meetings to call for a ceasefire, but are not coming to youth group because they don't see the church living out this faith. So I would just offer that as an additional perspective. We don't think about the folks who are younger than us sometimes being our teachers, but they are, well, to use a West Virginia example, a good canary in the coal mine. When things are going wrong quickly, it's the children that you're going to see catching it first. And catching on to it and exhibiting those symptoms more quickly. So when we take their leadership and consider what they need to be strong leaders for the future that we know they're facing, I hope we can take that into consideration too.
Thanks, Marietta. David and Philip, briefly, please, in that order. David and then Philip.
Yeah, well, thank you. Marietta's really laid out the campus and learning from our youngers. And I always say I'm part of a new and emerging group that's often in denial about our existence, which is the Yahoos, which is young at heart, otherwise older. And so I think sometimes the Yahoos, which would include some of us, but not all of us on this panel today, think we have all this life experience. And therefore, we should be the strategic vision makers, and come up with the answers. And then the other folks are like the foot soldiers in a good military model. And I want to suggest that, the most important thing, to build on what Marietta said, was intergenerational work. When I was 19 years old, my 76-year-old roommate at a nonviolent training camp, who had done repeated civil disobedience and been defrocked because he refused to condemn the Communist Party, that was in the Presbyterian Church, by the way, and he went on to become a Unitarian minister. I was like, holy crap, like you're 76 and you're still resisting things? Oh my God, what am I doing? I'm 19. And so there was so much I learned from him, and yet he wasn't telling me what to do. And I think that that's the challenge now. So clergy are great at worship, show up at encampments and offer support, pastoral calls, not to tell students what to do, to just say, we're with you. And one of the things I've learned from the labor movement is when Walmart workers who were not unionized would do walkout strikes because the conditions were so bad, or other places where they weren't unionized and were trying to unionize, a group of clergy showing up, of religious leaders from the community, and talking to the managers and said, we're watching. We're seeing what you do. So part of BDS is not just the nitty gritty of those campaigns, but it's showing solidarity and bringing leaders, relocating the leaders from the comfort of inside the church to out in the streets. The last two things I'll say is, with urgency, some folks have, it's like with the midst of genocide, how can we even have a strategic foresight task force? And I would say we need to think of what we're facing now is like a forest fire, not a house fire. In a house fire, folks can kind of safely okay, we've got the house that's on fire, it's discreet, the fire department can take care of it, the rest of us can just kind of support the fire department, whether it's a volunteer or paid. With a forest fire, it spreads so big, it's important to stop it in one area, but you've got to think wider than that. This is an all-out assault. And I think Marietta, again, talked about, The assaults on our communities go way beyond Palestine. But I think that the strategic foresight is what are the lessons in the struggles we're facing with rising fascism in the United States? Can we learn from our Palestinian siblings? The Kairos Palestine document and the work of Palestinians of decades of settler colonialism, decades of apartheid that they have faced is something that we can turn to now. And, folks out in Missouri and Ferguson, when Michael Brown was killed, it was in fact Palestinians that were some of the most helpful folks in solidarity with the African American community. And likewise, African Americans have turned around to reach out to Palestinians and say, we've dealt with Jim Crow and we're still facing more of it now. So I think that building of alliances is so important. I know you said to be short, but last thing is just I think it's really important for all of us to understand that we're part of a relay race. A lot of times people talk about run the race. I mean, Habakkuk talks in the second chapter after describing the violence of empire in the first chapter and whose own might is their God. Then Habakkuk is wanting some quick answers from God. And God's like, no, write the vision so that a runner may take it. And a lot of us have talked about this is a marathon. I have a neighbor who runs marathons and stuff. I'm like, I'm never going to run a marathon. That's not going to work. And so if we understand our work today as a relay race, if all of us are running at the same time, we're going to burn out. It's not going to make a difference. But if we understand that some of us need to step back, so one leg of that journey is the strategic thinking, the long-term thinking that's always needed, but that needs to be hand in hand with the sprinters. And so if I'd invite us all, and then we also need to take that moment of Sabbath rest. Even God rested. Those are my final thoughts.
Thanks, David. Philip?
I'll try to be brief. So, I'm a transplant. My kids still call me fresh off the boat because of my accent. But my reading of American history is that every emancipatory movement started with marginalized communities. The slaves. The student movement against the war in Vietnam, students were the vulnerable ones, but they didn't have any economic power or even voting power. But as these movements got closer and closer to the mainstream, they became effective. It is extremely important to protect these marginalized communities. Islamophobia has been the most powerful tool in the ideological toolbox of imperialism and Zionism, Israeli propaganda. The demonization of Hamas and portraying them as equivalent to Al-Qaeda and ISIS. So protect marginalized communities. And another thing that I think that's a strategic vision. Follow, the pattern of emancipatory movements in this country and see our movement as part of that. Protect the students, protect Muslims, protect, people who are on the left who are demonized also. The other thing is, again, a message to our leaders is stop talking to AJC. Holocaust experts are calling this a genocide, including many Israeli scholars of the Holocaust. Talk to rabbis for ceasefire. Talk to, if not now, to progressive Jewish groups that see this as a message of love to the people they care about in Israel, to their relatives, that they too are victims and that they are being duped by this, slaughter that is happening because it's affecting the economy, it's affecting their employment, it's affecting violence in their homes. People come back with PTSD, they commit suicide. It is no longer a viable society. Please listen to these Jews who are sending a message of love, not criticism to to Israelis, telling them that your leaders are driving drunk and it is your duty to take away the keys.
Thanks to the three of you. I want our guests to have the last word, but before I do, my name is Michael Spath, and I'm with the Indiana Center for Middle East Peace. And a reminder that this webinar will be recorded, and in a few days it'll be posted on our Indiana Center for Middle East Peace YouTube channel. So, Philip, any parting words for us?
Let somebody else go. Give me a minute.
Marietta?
Sure, I'll go. I think that this, like I said, I'm not relying anymore on governments to respond to moral arguments, but I do think that we as individuals still can respond to that. And if that's something that we feel moved by, especially for people who claim to be Christian, who call themselves Christian, and who are doing their best to follow Jesus's example of ministry and of a way of life, then this is our time to do something. I think we too often wait for somebody to give us permission or say, this is exactly the right thing to do. This is the steps, follow 1, 2, 3, and then we'll fix this evil problem that we're encountering. And especially with Palestine, that confusion is used to demobilize people, and really freeze a lot of folks in place who would otherwise be well-meaning. And there's a lot of things that you can complicate and reinterpret in scripture, but at the end of the day, there's more laws throughout the entire Bible, more directions about caring for people and loving people, and not just people, but all of creation, the whole thing, the whole environment, everything that God made. And the genocide that we're seeing in Gaza is an affront to God's creation at the end of the day. And we have to just pick the simplest of all the laws that God gives us to know that this is not the right thing to do. So I would encourage us to lean into that bravery of being a Christian, and of remembering that that's part of what we are called to do and be and embody in the world as a physical witness of justice and love, and creating a place where the fullness of humanity can thrive. And that's recognizing that in everyone, including Israeli soldiers, because you lose your own humanity when you are busy oppressing someone else. So freeing Palestine does free Israelis in the end too. It frees all of these people from losing touch with their own souls. So I call us to remember that as Christians too, that is part of us, of loving our enemy as well, that those of us who are doing this justice work, it is all rooted in love, and it's rooted in love for all people. And we want to stop anybody that we would consider our friends or our enemies from losing touch with their own soul. And I think that we can do that. I hope that we can.
Thank you, Marietta. Philip?
Yes, I am learning so much from young organizers. Recently, Christians for Free Palestine was part of a coalition. I think it probably led a coalition with JVP and, if not now, and other groups protesting Christians United for Israel's annual conference here in the DC area. And they had red, yellow, and green actions, signifying the level of risk that people are willing to take. I believe very strongly that red actions, where you really practice civil disobedience and do things that really attract attention and defy, the power elite, are very important. But there are also options for yellow and green, and this is a metaphor for what I think all of us can do. Some are going to do the brave, very courageous activities that involve some level of sacrifice, and others may not be able to do that for different and valid reasons. So please find that level of risk that you are willing to take, but please be brave and do not and speak truth to power. Do not obfuscate the reality of a genocide.
Thanks, Philip. David.
Yeah, thank you. I did like, I think just to follow up on Philip's last phrase of, about genocide and the importance of naming it, there is a power, we in the church believe in the power of the word. So while I'm all about action, public word, though not private word, is really important. But I would say that the biggest danger I would say is that we are so urgent to get a ceasefire to stop the genocide. But every ceasefire that has happened momentarily, not only last, 2 years, but in decades, has always been in Gaza only. And it has not been in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. And so the genocide is going to continue in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem through ethnic cleansing, through apartheid, through settler colonialism, and all of the manifestations of that. Even if we're able, at the point at which we're able to stop the slaughter in Gaza, and even as we're looking and governments are looking to rebuild or do something in Gaza, the danger is we have to look at it systematically. And so I think challenging our church leaders to just reject any balanced language. So every time that bishops and clergy and other church leaders feel the need to cite October 7th, in order to be able to speak about the slaughter of Palestinians, we have to mention October 7th. Stop it. Stop it. Every life is sacred. And if we cannot speak about Palestinian children starving today in and of itself, regardless of how we got here, then we've lost our souls. We have lost. And so in that sense, I'd say remind everybody in the churches, examine the log in our own eye first. And the log in our own eye is U.S. policies. It's the church's complicity in framing this as this balance and refusal to name the suffering. And I would say, Philip, you raised about Islamophobia. I think we have to talk much more explicitly about anti-Palestinian racism, because I've heard way too many, even Anti-Defamation League will talk about Islamophobia and erase Palestinians from that equation. And so it's a more specific thing that we need to talk about. And the last thing is, Jesus reminds us, like, he's not telling us what to believe. He says, follow me, over and over and over again, follow me. But following means you're on a journey. And the journey is where we find and build community together. And the journeys and the struggle for justice are where we find love, we find community and restored relationships that deal with the permanent traumatic stress disorder that so many folks in our own communities, as well as in Palestine, have. And where we find some joy, even in the midst of all the suffering. And so, I know all the folks on the call are in the movement. So keep spreading that. Bring some other folks in. Don't keep it to ourselves. We're not a light under a bushel, but let that shine out to folks. And that might be the greatest form of evangelism / organizing that we can do. Thank you.
I want to say thank you to my three friends, Marietta Macy, David Wildman, and Philip Farah, for their insights, and really the three of you, for each one of you kind of being models for the rest of us, and just your long-standing work in the cause of justice. And I know I speak on behalf of Marietta, David, and Philip to say thank you to Churches for Middle East Peace for convening us at the Carter Center in Atlanta a few weeks ago, and on their behalf to say thank you to all of you for joining us today. Look, Philip, David, Marietta, and all of you, thank you very much.